The boy was already moving before anyone in that room fully understood what they were watching. He had been standing beside his mother near the front of the ballroom, close enough to the stage that the light from the overhead chandeliers caught the top of his dark blonde hair and made it look almost gold. He had been standing there the way he always stood in public spaces, pressed slightly inward, shoulders drawn together, both hands loose at his sides, not fidgeting, not scanning the room the way most children would, just existing in that particular still and private way that had become the whole world's explanation for him over the past 18 months. He had been standing there, and then he had simply stopped standing there. He had taken one step away from his mother's side, then another, and then he was walking. There were 312 people in that ballroom. The invitation list had been reviewed 4 separate times by the event coordinator, a meticulous woman named Patricia Holt, who had been running fundraising galas for the state's wealthiest families for going on 22 years. And she could tell you without checking her clipboard that 312 individuals had confirmed their attendance, and every single one of them had shown up. 312 of the wealthiest, most powerful, most socially connected people in the entire state of Connecticut all gathered in the grand ballroom of the Harrington Hotel on a Thursday evening in early November, all of them in formal wear, all of them holding champagne flutes or sparkling water, all of them arranged around tables draped in ivory linen with centerpieces that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. And every single one of them went quiet. It happened in a wave, the way silence always travels through a large room when something genuinely unexpected begins to occur. The conversations nearest the boy dropped first, the people closest to him catching the movement in their peripheral vision and turning to look, and then the silence spread outward in concentric rings until it reached the far edges of the room and lapped up against the walls, and 312 people were all looking in the same direction at the same time. The boy was 6 years old. His name was Garrett, and Garrett Whitmore had not spoken a full sentence to another living soul outside of his own home in 18 months. His mother had made the declaration 11 weeks earlier at the same foundation summer benefit, standing at a podium in front of 200 guests with her chin raised and her voice perfectly steady, even though the woman who knew her best said afterward that her hands had been shaking behind the lectern the entire time. She had said it plainly and without drama because she was not a dramatic woman. She had said that she understood people cared about her future and about Garrett's future, and she was grateful for that care. Truly she was. But she wanted everyone who was present and everyone who would hear about this evening to understand something clearly. She would not be considering any romantic partnership of any kind, not now and not in any foreseeable future, unless and until her son chose someone for himself. Her words exactly, unless and until my son chooses someone for himself. Every person in that room had understood immediately what she meant. Garrett Whitmore had not spoken a full sentence to a stranger in a year and a half. He had not initiated contact with an unfamiliar adult in longer than that. The therapist used the clinical term selective mutism and then layered several other designations on top of it, and his mother, Diane Whitmore, had sat through every single one of those consultations with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed, and then driven home and stood in the kitchen for a long time staring at the wall above the sink. What she had said at that podium was not a challenge, and it was not a romantic gesture, and it was not the opening of a door. It was a locked door. It was a locked door with a key already gone. Every wealthy, ambitious man in her social world understood that perfectly. Garrett Whitmore choosing someone would require Garrett Whitmore to walk across a room and make a voluntary choice. And Garrett Whitmore had not done anything that could be described as a voluntary social choice in 18 months. So the room understood. The room had understood for 11 weeks. And now the room was watching Garrett Whitmore walk. He walked past the first table. A man named Charles Burrell, who had sent Garrett an imported remote control car the previous Christmas and spent 45 minutes that same evening crouched down performing enthusiastic interest in Garrett's face, while Garrett looked somewhere past his left ear, watched the boy walk past without a flicker of acknowledgement. Garrett did not look at Charles Burrell. He did not look at the next table either, where a man named Roger Ashby sat with 2 of his business partners. Roger, who had twice taken Garrett to professional baseball games and smiled the whole time for his mother's benefit and checked his phone every 12 minutes. Garrett walked past the third table, past the fourth. His footsteps were nearly silent on the polished floor. Someone near the back of the room made a small involuntary sound. something between a gasp and a held breath, and the person next to them put a hand on their arm. The room watched Garrett Whitmore walk past every important person in it. He walked in a single straight line, unhesitating, undeviating, the way a person walks when they already know exactly where they're going and have known for some time. He walked past the long side table where the catering staff had arranged the dessert service. He walked past the two men from the foundation board who were standing near the side wall, discussing something that no longer mattered. He walked past the enormous flower arrangement on its pedestal near the back corner, and he walked toward the very back of the room, where the service doors were, where the light was dimmer and the ceiling felt lower, where a man in an ill-fitting dark jacket was standing alone next to a tray of used glasses with a small plate of food he had not finished eating. The man's name was Dale Cutter. He was 38 years old. He drove a school bus for the Millhaven Unified School District, Route 7, the North Side Loop, 41 children every morning and every afternoon, Monday through Friday for the past 6 years. Dale Cutter watched that boy walk toward him and did the thing that most people in his position would have done. He looked behind himself. He actually turned his head and looked at the service doors and the tray of glasses and the dim wall behind him to see who else might be back here, who the child must really be aiming for. There was no one there. Garrett Whitmore stopped directly in front of Dale Cutter. He tipped his head back and looked all the way up, and then he reached out and took Dale's hand. Not reached toward it, not brushed it, took it, both small fingers wrapping around Dale's first two fingers the way a child reaches for something they are completely certain of. And then Garrett spoke. He said, "You always slow down for the dog on Birchwood Lane." 8 words, specific and plain and private, the truest possible summary of 18 months of small mornings. Diane Whitmore was standing 6 feet away. Both of her hands came up and pressed flat against her mouth. Her eyes did not close. She was watching her son's face, and tears were running openly down her face in front of 312 people because she was hearing her child's voice in a public room for the first time since the morning her husband died. Then someone near the stage, a kind-hearted woman who meant absolutely no harm by it, said out loud what every person in that room was already thinking. She said, "Well, I believe that is a proposal if I have ever seen one." The laughter was warm and delighted and completely immediate. 312 faces turned in a single slow wave toward the back of the room, toward the service doors, toward the dim corner, toward Dale Cutter holding his child's hand in his borrowed jacket with his unfinished plate of food on the tray beside him. And Dale understood in one cold and perfectly clear second exactly what every person in that room expected him to do next. What he did instead was the one single thing that not one person in that room saw coming, least of all Diane Whitmore. But before that story gets told all the way through, there is something that needs to be said to the person watching this right now. If you have ever been the person standing at the back of the room that nobody important ever once actually bothered to see, the one the world looks straight past without a second thought, then hit that subscribe button right now, because that is exactly who this channel is built for. Go on. The story will wait. Then let the story back all the way up. Because to understand why that child crossed an entire room full of 312 powerful people to find Dale Cutter standing next to a tray of used glasses, the beginning has to be told properly. And the beginning is not that ballroom. The beginning is an ordinary Tuesday morning on Route 7, and a boy who had gone completely silent, and a man who decided without making any kind of decision about it all to simply slow down. Dale Cutter woke up every morning at 5:17. Not 5:15, not 5:30, 5:17, because that was when the garbage truck made its first pass down Alderman Street, and the hydraulic whine of its compressor worked its way through the walls of the rented duplex like an alarm clock that could not be argued with or snoozed. He had been waking up to that sound for 4 years, since the divorce was finalized, and he had moved into the south half of the duplex at 14 Alderman Street with 2 duffel bags and a box of kitchen things, and his daughter Penny's purple toothbrush that she had left at his apartment the weekend before, and that he had carefully packed without thinking too hard about what it meant to be packing your daughter's toothbrush into a moving box. Penny was 9 now. She stayed with Dale Tuesday nights and every other weekend, and on the mornings after she had slept over, which were the Tuesday mornings when he drove her to school before he went to the bus yard. Dale would find her already sitting at the kitchen table in her pajamas with her hair doing its complicated morning business in every direction, eating cereal and reading whatever book she was currently 300 pages into, completely self-contained and deeply happy about it. She would look up when he came in and say, "Morning, Dad," without putting the book down, and then go back to reading. And Dale would make his coffee and stand at the counter and watch her read and feel the particular warmth of that moment settle into his chest like something physical and real. That was the whole morning right there. That was the part that made the rest of it worth doing. He had been driving Route 7 for 6 years. He had taken the job the year before the divorce, when it became clear that the hours at the warehouse were making it impossible to be present for Penny the way he wanted to be, the way his own father never quite managed to be, and the school district job had morning and afternoon runs with a long break in the middle of the day that he could fill with other work if he needed to, or with errands, or just with sitting in the bus yard eating a sandwich in the quiet, which some days was exactly what a person needed. The pay was not impressive. The benefits were solid, and the work had turned out to matter to him in ways he had not anticipated when he took it. 6 years of the same 41 children every morning had taught Dale things about human beings that he was not sure could be taught any other way. He had learned to read a child in the first 3 seconds of the bus door opening, not read them the way a teacher reads for academic readiness, or the way a coach reads for athletic potential. Read them the way a person reads weather, the way someone who has spent enough time paying attention learns to feel the specific quality of the air and understand what is coming before it arrives. He knew which kids were carrying something before they put their first foot on the step. He knew it in the way they held their backpack straps, in whether they looked at him when they climbed on, or whether their eyes went straight to the floor, in whether they sat up front near him, or pushed to the very back and compressed themselves into the corner, in the particular quality of the silence from a child who was simply tired versus the particular quality of the silence from a child who had heard something the night before that they were still working through their whole body. Most of the time, Dale did nothing with this information except hold it gently and drive the route. He was not a therapist. He was not trained in any clinical sense. What he was present, completely and consistently present. 41 children at a time, every morning before the world got its full grip on them. And it come to believe over 6 years that this particular window of the morning, the window between the house and school, was one of the most honest and unguarded moments in a child's entire day. They had not yet been asked to perform anything. They had not yet been evaluated or corrected or required to produce a result. They were just themselves in transition. And if a person simply paid attention during that window without trying to change anything, they learned an enormous amount. Dale was not good at many things that the world assigned high value to. He was not a compelling conversationalist at parties. He was not ambitious in any direction that the people who had grown up around him would have recognized. He had a small savings account and a rented duplex and a 14-year-old truck that he maintained carefully because he could not afford to replace it. And he spent his evenings reading or watching baseball or talking on the phone with Penny on the nights she was at her mother's. His life did not look like much from the outside. From the inside, it felt like exactly enough. He loved his work. He loved it in the specific and unperformative way that comes from doing something that matters without needing anyone else to confirm that it matters. He loved the weight of 41 small lives placed in his hands every morning for 40 minutes. He loved the way the bus smelled in November, that particular combination of cold air and wet coats and someone's lunch packed too early. He loved the rhythm of the route, Alderman to Birchwood to Maple Court to the long straightaway on River Road, and then the left onto school grounds. He could drive it in his sleep, and on bad mornings sometimes felt like he was. Most people drove past Dale Cutter without noticing him. The parents standing at the bus stop looked at their phones while they waited and looked at their children when the bus pulled up, and then turned and walked back to their houses without particularly registering that there was a man behind who had been showing up for their child every single morning for 6 years. That was fine. That was how it was supposed to work. Mostly, a school bus driver who needed a great deal of acknowledgement from the parent of his riders would have a very difficult time in this job. But what Dale had learned over 6 years and through 400-something individual children who had ridden his route at one time or another was this: children noticed. Children, the small ones especially, the ones between 4 and 7, register his presence in a way that their parents no longer did because children had not yet learned not to. They had not yet learned to look straight through the people who showed up to do the ordinary necessary work of keeping their small lives running. They still saw the person. All of them, every single one, registered Dale Cutter as a specific human being and not as a function. And some of them, the particular ones, the ones who were paying the most careful attention to the world because the world had recently given them reason to pay very careful attention indeed, noticed things about Dale that most adults in their lives would never have noticed. They noticed that he said good morning to each child individually as they boarded. Not as a group, not a single greeting aimed at the bus generally, but a specific good morning directed at each specific face. They noticed that he remembered things, not in a showy way, just in the way of a person who was genuinely paying attention. He knew that Marcus on the morning after a Mets game would have opinions. He knew that the twins from Birchwood always sat in the same seats and were bothered on the days when someone else had taken them. He knew that the small girl who got on at Maple Court was afraid of the sound the brakes made, and so he eased into stops more gently than the route technically required. He had never decided to do any of this. It had accumulated the way all genuine habits accumulate, through repetition and attention, and the small daily decision to care about the thing in front of you. Most people never bothered to look. That was the whole story. Everything else was details. Garrett Whitmore first appeared on Route 7 on a Wednesday morning in early September, 14 months before the gala. Dale had known he was coming. The district sent a route notification when a new child was added to the stop, and Garrett's file had a notation from the previous school's records flag for driver awareness, which was the district's careful language for a child who might need additional consideration during the boarding process. Dale had read the notation in the break room the afternoon before, sitting at the plastic table with his coffee going cold, and then he had folded the paper once and put it in his jacket pocket and thought about it on the drive home. The stop was 4 Ridgecrest Circle. He had never had a pickup at that address before. It was one of the newer streets on the north side of the route, lined with large houses set back from the road with long driveways, the kind of neighborhood where people drove their children to school in the kind of cars Dale's truck would have looked embarrassed parked next to. The fact that a child from Ridgecrest Circle was riding the bus at all was slightly unusual, but not unheard of. Sometimes parents had early commitments. Sometimes it was a grandparent handling mornings. Sometimes it was a kind of household where things had recently changed and the old arrangements no longer held. Dale pulled to stop at 7:12 on that first Wednesday and opened the bus doors and waited. The woman who brought Garrett to the bus was not a grandmother. She was in her mid-30s, dark-haired, wearing a coat that even Dale's completely inexpert eye could identify as expensive, and she walked Garrett to the bottom of the driveway with her hand resting very lightly between his shoulder blades, not gripping, not steering, just there. Garrett walked with his eyes on the ground in front of his feet, not watching the bus, not watching the street, watching the specific 2 feet of pavement directly ahead of him as if the rest of the world could be safely managed if he limited his attention to that small, reliable square. He was small for 5, which was the age in his file, fine-boned and pale, with the kind of blonde hair that looked like it had been lighter when he was a baby and was slowly darkening towards something else. He had on a navy blue jacket with the collar turned up even though it was not particularly cold, and a backpack that was slightly too large for his frame and that he carried with both straps on, as if the weight of it was something he was actively grateful for, something to hold on to. He stopped at the bottom of the bus steps. His mother crouched briefly and said something close to his ear that Dale could not hear from the driver's seat. Garrett did not respond in any visible way. His mother stood back up, and Garrett put 1 foot on the first step, and then the second, and then he was on the bus. He did not look at Dale. Dale said, "Good morning." Simple and plain, not performed. Not extra warm in the way adults sometimes performed warmth to children who were struggling, that hovering, slightly too bright energy that children could smell a mile away. Just good morning, the same as he said to every child, the same 2 words, the same level tone. Garrett walked past him without looking up and went all the way to the back of the bus and sat in the last seat on the right side and placed his backpack in his lap and looked out the window. Dale closed the doors and pulled back out onto Ridgecrest Circle. Over the days that followed, Dale learned what he could from the margins of adult conversation that drifted up to the front of the bus. He He learned sideways, in pieces, the way adults forget that children are not the only ones listening when they talk to each other at bus stops and school entrances and quiet corners of the parking lot. He learned that Garrett's father had died 11 months earlier. His name had been Thomas Whitmore. He had been killed in a car accident on Route 9 during a February ice storm, driving home from a board meeting, 41 years old. Garrett had been 4 years old. The family had moved to Ridgecrest Circle over the summer, relocating from the house in Weston where Thomas and Diane had lived since before Garrett was born, and the adults who discussed this at bus stops did so in the lowered voices people use when they are talking about grief in the vicinity of people who are currently living it. Garrett had been, by all accounts Dale ever overheard, a different child before, bright and verbal and inclined toward loud enthusiasms about specific things. Dinosaurs for a period, then fire trucks, then a period of nearly evangelical devotion to the subject of sharks. He had talked constantly, the way certain small children do, with the complete confidence that whoever was near them would find their observations as compelling as they found them themselves. And then his father had died, and that child had simply stopped, not gradually. Suddenly, in the weeks after the accident, Garrett had pulled inward with a completeness and a speed that frightened every adult around him. The specialist had a term for it. Several terms, actually, layered on top of each other in the way clinical language accumulates around a child whose interior life is refusing to be neatly categorized. Selective mutism was a primary designation, complicated by acute grief response and what one assessment had called a withdrawal presentation consistent with prolonged bereavement in early childhood. The reports were thorough and specific and completely inadequate. They did not tell one true thing about what it actually looked like to watch a small boy sit in the last seat on the right side of the school bus and stare out the window at the street going past with particular quality of attention of a person waiting for something they already understood, somewhere deep in their body, was not coming back. He did not talk on the bus. Not to Dale, not to the other children, not to himself under his breath the way some children did when they thought no one was listening. He was not shy in the ordinary way that some children are shy. Shy children look at you from the corners of their eyes. They turn their faces into their parents' shoulders. They conduct small assessments of adults from behind the safety of things. Garrett did not do any of that. He simply was not available. He was present in his body and absent in every way that involved contact with the world outside it. And the absence was so complete and so contained that it felt less like a mood or a phase and more like a decision that had been made below the level of language. Every adult in Garrett's life was trying to fix him. Dale understood this not from any single piece of information, but from the accumulated texture of what he observed. The way Garrett's body was always very slightly braced when he boarded the bus, the set of his shoulders and the angle of his jaw that spoke of a person who has learned to expect a certain kind of attention and has organized their whole body against it. The way he sat with his backpack in his lap, even after other children had tucked theirs under the seat or thrown them in the overhead rack, as if the backpack was the thing between him and everything else. The way his eyes moved when he was on the bus, not scanning the other children, not watching the street with the kind of engagement a child has when the world still feels like a place full of things that might delight them, but watching in the flat and private way of a person who is maintaining a necessary vigil that they cannot explain to anyone. The therapists came at Garrett with their gentle structured approaches. His mother came at him with her frightened love, which was the most powerful and most destabilizing force in his daily life. Because children feel the weight of their parents' fear the way they feel changes in air pressure before a storm. They feel it in themselves. They cannot make it smaller because they cannot fix the thing that created it. And so they carry it on top of everything else they're already carrying, and the weight becomes a whole world. Garrett's mother had good people around her, people who gave her solid advice and real support, and she was doing everything correctly, every single thing she had been told to do, and none of it was reaching particular locked place in her son. Dale did not try to fix Garrett. He made that decision not as a decision, not as a strategy, not as something he had read in a book or been trained to do. He made it the way he made most of his decisions about the children on his bus, which was by looking carefully and then doing or not doing whatever the looking told him. What the looking told him was this: Garrett Whitmore was a child who was exhausted by the world's attempts to reach him. He did not need one more reaching adult. He needed something quieter than that. He needed to be in the presence of a person who was not waiting for him to respond, not brace for his silence, not measuring the distance between who he was right now and who everyone hoped he was going to eventually become. So Dale said good morning every day and drove the route, and did not ask anything of Garrett at all. The dog lived at 7 Birchwood Lane. It was an old golden retriever, muzzle gone completely white, who spent its mornings lying in a narrow strip of grass between the sidewalk and the street in front of the Harmon house, regardless of weather, regardless of temperature, as if this particular patch of ground had been assigned to this dog by some arrangement older than either of them. The dog's name, Dale had gathered from a conversation between two of the older children on his bus, was Chester. Chester Harmon, more or less, belonging to the retired couple in the yellow house who were, according to the older children, approximately 100 years old, which Dale interpreted as meaning they were somewhere in their 70s. Chester was there every morning when the bus turned onto Birchwood. Dale had been turning onto Birchwood for 6 years, and Chester had been there for 4 of those 6 years. And sometime in the second year of Chester's tenure at that particular patch of grass, Dale had begun to slow the bus slightly as they passed, not stopping, not making a production of it, just easing back on the speed by a small but noticeable amount so that the passage of the bus had a different quality to it than the rest of the route, a quality of something being observed and honored rather than simply driven past. He had not thought about why he did this. He had not considered whether it was noticed. On Garrett's third Wednesday on the bus, Dale was coming up Birchwood at his usual pace, and he eased back as Chester came into view, and he registered without fully registering it that Garrett had moved, not dramatically, not even significantly, from anyone else's perspective, but Garrett had shifted slightly forward in his seat in the back of the bus, and his face had turned toward the window at the angle of a person who was watching something they want to get the full picture of, and as the bus slowed and rolled past Chester, lying in his patch of grass, something in Garrett's face changed. It was a very small change. It lasted less than 5 seconds. But Dale saw it, because Dale saw things, and what he saw was the face of a child who had for one brief moment stopped waiting and simply looked. Dale did not say anything. He did not mention Chester. He did not lean toward the rear-view mirror and make that moment into a moment by acknowledging it. He drove the rest of the route, and dropped the children at school, and drove the empty bus back to the yard, and sat in the lot for a few minutes drinking the rest of his coffee. On Thursday morning, he slowed for Chester the same way he always had. On Friday, he slowed again. The following Tuesday, Garrett was not on the bus because it was the beginning of the month, and Diane Whitmore had a standing early appointment on the first Tuesday. On Wednesday, Garrett was back, backpack in his lap, last seat on the right, eyes on the ground until the bus was moving. And when they turned onto Birchwood, and the bus began to ease back at speed, Garrett was already at the window. That was how it began. Dale never slowed for Chester because of Garrett. He had been slowing for Chester before Garrett existed on his route. But the fact that he had already been doing this thing for his own private and inarticulate reasons, and that Garrett's particular attention had found it the way water finds a channel, was the first real thing that happened between them. And it happened entirely without words and entirely without either of them making any kind of deliberate arrangement. Over the following weeks, Dale began to notice other things. The quality of Garrett's attention changed slightly on Tuesdays, which was a day the older kids in the high school had late start and the bus was quieter than usual. On those mornings, Garrett seemed to breathe differently, more evenly, his shoulders a fraction less gathered. Dale began to understand that the noise level on the bus was a variable that cost Garrett something he could not afford to spend. And on the Tuesday mornings, when the bus was quieter, some small amount of what was being spent was given back. He noticed that Garrett looked at the large oak on the corner of River Road and Maple Court with the same quality of attention he gave Chester. The oak was enormous and very old, its canopy so wide that the bus passed beneath it every morning, and the light through the windows changed briefly, going dappled and golden for the 6 or 8 seconds it took to clear the tree's reach. Dale had been passing under that tree for 6 years and had not thought specifically about it as a thing Garrett might be watching. But one morning in October, he caught Garrett's face in the rear-view mirror in the moment of passing under the oak and saw it again. That brief change, that moment of the waiting face becoming a face that was simply present. Dale did not slow for the oak. He did not mark it. He simply drove the route. What he did was this. Every morning when Garrett boarded the bus, Dale said good morning. The same 2 words. No elaboration, No special warmth deployed specifically at Garrett. No pause that communicated anything except the simple fact of one person acknowledging another. And then Dale looked back at the road and drove, and did not look at Garrett in the mirror again unless something required his attention, and gave that child the rarest and most valuable thing in his daily life. He gave him the experience of being in the presence of an adult who was not watching him for signs. The first time Garrett looked directly at Dale was a morning in late October, a sharp blue sky morning with frost on the lawns along Birchwood. Chester at his post as always, breath coming off him in small visible puffs. Dale was watching the road and registered in his peripheral vision that the quality of the silence at the back of the bus had changed, and when he glanced in the rearview mirror, he found Garrett's eyes already there, already on the mirror, on the small reflected square of Dale's face. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then Garrett looked away. Dale looked back at the road. His hands were steady on the wheel. His expression did not change. Inside his chest something opened very quietly. The way a window opens on a morning when the air outside is exactly the same temperature as the air inside, and the opening costs nothing and gives everything. He did not tell anyone about it. There was no one to tell. Really, he mentioned it to no one in the bus yard, said nothing about it to anyone at pickup, did not think about it in any way that he could have later put into words. He simply drove the route the next morning the same way he had always driven it, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. In November, Garrett drew him something. Dale did not see it happen. He did not see Garrett take the small notebook from the outer pocket of his backpack, or bend over it for the last 10 minutes of the route. He did not see Garrett tear out the page, fold it twice, fold it again into a small and very precise square, and hold in his fist all the way to the school doors. What he saw was Garrett standing at the front of the bus as the last of the other children filed off, not moving toward the door, holding the folded square in his closed hand at his side, looking at the floor of the bus. Dale sat. He did not lean over, did not extend his hand, did not say anything. He waited, the way he had learned to wait on this route, completely still, asking nothing, watching the road out the windshield. Garrett placed the folded square on the edge of the step by the door, not handed it over, placed it, and then stepped off the bus without looking back. Dale picked it up after the bus had cleared and the doors were closed. He unfolded it carefully, all 4 folds, smoothing the creases. It was Chester, a very precise and earnest rendering of an old dog lying in a patch of grass, drawn in pencil with the kind of specific attention that comes from studying something repeatedly and wanting to get it right. The grass was individual blades. The dog's paws were crossed in front of it. The muzzle was white and the body was shaded, and the eyes were looking at nothing in particular, the way Chester's eyes always looked, at the middle distance of a life well lived and almost finished. Dale sat with that drawing for a long time. The bus yard was quiet around him. The morning traffic on the street outside was doing what it always did. He held the small unfolded page and felt the precise and private weight of what it meant that a child who was carrying everything Garrett Whitmore was carrying and spent a part of his morning, without anyone asking, making something for him. He did not make a thing of it. The next morning, he said good morning the same way he always said it, and drove the route and slowed for Chester and said nothing about the drawing. But he had put it on the refrigerator at 14 Alderman Street, held there by a magnet from the zoo that Penny had brought home 3 summers ago, and was still there 4 months later, when the invitation to the gala arrived in the district staff newsletter, and Dana from the central office was standing in the hallway asking people to please just consider it. It would really mean something to the foundation board if the support staff attended. He came to love that boy. He did not decide to. It was not an event. It was an accumulation, the way winter light accumulates in the spring without any single morning being the morning it happens. And by the time Dale understood that he had come to love Garrett Whitmore, he had loved him for some time already, and the love was not new, only the naming of it. Every morning was its own small thing. The good morning that asked for nothing, the slowing for Chester, the oak in its seasonal changes, bare through winter, budding in March, full green by the time the school year ended. The drawings that appeared 3 more times between November and June, each one slid onto the step and abandoned without eye contact, each one a different thing from the route. The oak tree, the frost-covered fence at the corner of Maple Court, a sparrow that had spent several mornings sitting on the same telephone wire at the bus stop on Alderman. For drawings total, each one precise and unhurried, and given away a person gives something they've made carefully and cannot quite explain why. Dale had all 4 on the refrigerator by the time June came. He was not Garrett's therapist. He was not his teacher. He was not in any clinical or formal sense responsible for this child healing. He was a man who drove a bus, who slowed down for a dog, who said good morning every day and meant it, and who had learned without being told that some people need a room to come toward you on their own schedule, and any attempt to close that distance from your end, however well-intentioned, adds more weight to a load that is already too heavy. When the school year ended and the last morning came and Garrett filed off the bus with the other children on the last day of June, Dale said good morning the way he always did, and Garrett at the top of the steps stopped. He did not turn around. He stood at the top of those steps for a full 3 seconds with his back to Dale and his backpack on both shoulders, and then he walked off the bus. Dale drove the empty bus back to the yard. He sat in the parking lot for a while. He ate his lunch. He thought about whether he wanted to stop for coffee on the way home, and decided that he did. He was back at Ridgecrest Circle at 7:12 on the first Wednesday of September. Diane Whitmore was 36 years old, and she had more money than she would ever spend in 2 lifetimes, and she was the loneliest person in any room she walked into. This was not something she said to anyone. It was not something she had ever said to herself in those exact words. But it was a precise and accurate description of her life from the morning Thomas died through every single day of the 2 years that followed, and anyone who had known her before and watched her carefully since would have recognized it as the truth about her even if she never confirmed it out loud. Thomas Whitmore had been many things. He had been a good businessman, and a careful father, and a man who read actual books and remembered what was in them, and made his wife laugh reliably for 14 years of a marriage that had been built on a particular kind of compatibility that looks like ordinary friendship from the outside, and is in fact the rarest thing 2 people can build together. He had also been the person who stood between Diane and the world, not in a protective way, not in a way that diminished her, but in the way of a person whose very presence makes the social negotiations of a wealthy and highly visible life manageable, because you are not doing them alone. When Thomas died, Diane discovered that she had not fully understood how much of the social world she had been navigating through the fact of him, not his money, which was significant, and not his connections, which were considerable, but his actual self, the specific gravity of him, the way he had always known which room to enter and which to leave, and had always, without making anything of it, made sure she knew too. Without him, she was simply a very wealthy widow with a silent child and a great deal of property, and a social world that had immediately, and without anyone's particular malice, reorganized itself around the fact of her new status. The men appeared quickly. This was not cynicism. This was a simple, observable reality of what happened when a woman in Diane's position lost a spouse. Some of them she had known for years, had liked and respected, and understood to be decent people in their ordinary lives. But something about the combination of her widowhood and her fortune, and her difficulties seemed to activate a quality in them that she had never encountered before. They were attentive in a specific way, a way that felt to Diane like being very carefully studied. They remembered her preferences. They were thoughtful about Garrett, publicly and elaborately thoughtful about Garrett, in a way that should have felt like kindness, and instead felt like a kind of theater that Garrett himself, even silent, even 4 years old, and then 5 years old, and wrapped his grief, seemed to see through completely. There had been 3 of them, in particular, over the course of the first year. A man named Pierce Wakefield, who was charming and good-looking, and who had twice ruffled Garrett's hair a way that made Garrett go very still, the way an animal goes still near something uncertain. A man named Gregory Farr, who had sent Garrett an incredibly expensive train set, and then stood in Diane's living room watching her unwrap it with the patient expression of a man who has purchased the next stage of plan and is now waiting for it to execute. And a man named Stuart Holloway, who was the most careful of the 3, the most attuned to Diane's intelligence, the one who knew that the direct approach would not work, and so had taken the longer road of simply being present and consistent and useful, and who Diane had the most trouble dismissing even as she understood with complete clarity what he was doing. None of them were malicious. She did not believe any of them were deliberately bad men. They were simply men who looked at her situation and saw something that could be navigated toward a desirable outcome. And the navigating was so normalized in their world, so ordinary a thing for a powerful man to do in the presence of opportunity, that she suspected most of them did not fully understand they were doing it. Garrett understood it completely. Children are the finest detectors of human falseness that exist. They have not yet learned to give people the benefit of the doubt, which is an adult skill that is useful in proportion to how much you need from other adults and decreases in usefulness exactly as your need for their goodwill decreases. Garrett needed nothing from these men, and so extended them nothing, not even the minimal performance of engagement that a child who needed something from an adult might have managed. He looked at Pierce Wakefield with a face that registered nothing. He did not go near the train set. He left the room whenever Stuart Holloway was in it, silently and completely, and sat on the back stairs of particular quality of waiting that had become his whole mode of existing in the world. Diane had made the declaration at the summer benefit because she was exhausted, not because she had thought it through in terms of its practical implications. She had not been imagining a chess game or engineering an escape hatch. She had been standing at that podium, worn completely down to the bone by 2 years of grief and siege and the specific exhaustion of being a person everyone wants something from, and the words had come out with the weight of a simple and absolute truth. My son will choose. Not me. My son will choose. She had known as she said it that it was a declaration of permanent inaccessibility dressed in the language of a mother's love, and she had not been ashamed of that. It was accurate on both counts. She would not let anyone near Garrett under false pretenses, would not allow his silent and grieving presence to be used as a stage for performances of fatherhood, and she would not, under any circumstances that she could currently imagine, open herself to any of the men currently circling her, because every one of them had looked at her son and seen an obstacle to manage. Every one of them had seen him. None of them had looked. She had been watching for something she could not have named precisely, some quality of real attention, some evidence that a person could be in the presence of her son's silence without needing it to be something other than what it was. She had been watching for almost 2 years, and she had not seen it in anyone until November, until a school district staff newsletter on the passenger seat of her car mentioned the name of the bus driver on Route 7, Dale Cutter, in a note from the principal of Garrett's school about the extraordinary care and consistency of the morning routine he provided. She had read that note sitting in the school parking lot and felt something she could not quite name shift in her chest. She had folded the newsletter and put it in her bag and had not done anything about it for 2 weeks. Then she had gone to see Dana at the central office and asked Dana to make sure Dale Cutter received an invitation to the November gala. Dale almost did not go. Dana had found him in the bus yard on the Tuesday before the gala and handed him the invitation with particular energy of someone who genuinely wanted the answer to be yes and was trying not to make that too obvious. The gala was on a Thursday evening. Formal attire preferred. The Harrington Hotel, 7 o'clock. The Whitmore Foundation was the organizing body. The foundation raised money for children's education programs throughout the state, which was a cause Dale considered genuinely good, and the fact that the staff of the district programs were being included in the event was, Dana said, a meaningful recognition of the people who did the daily work that made the foundation's mission real. Dale held the invitation and thought about his Thursday. His Thursday evenings in November looked like this. Home from the afternoon run by 4:30. Heat up something from the freezer or make eggs if he could be bothered. Watch whatever was on. Call Penny at 7. In bed by 9:30 because the 5:17 alarm was not interested in his social calendar. He had no particular affection for formal events. He owned one suit, purchased for his cousin's wedding in 2019 and worn twice since. The collar of the dress shirt was half a size too small now, which he knew from trying on the previous spring for another event he had ultimately not attended. Dana said it would genuinely mean something. He thought about that on the drive home. He thought about whether things genuinely meaning something was a sufficient reason to put on a collar that did not fit and drive 40 minutes to stand in a hotel ballroom among people whose tax brackets began where his salary ceiling ended. He decided provisionally that it might be. He called Penny and asked if she could stay at her mom's Thursday instead of Tuesday that week, and Penny said, "Sure, Dad, whatever you need," in the completely easy way she had. And he said he loved her and hung up. He got the suit dry cleaned on Wednesday and stood in the small bathroom on Thursday evening wrestling with the collar and deciding that he was not a man who could be defeated by a collar, and that if it was truly unbearable, he could loosen it after the first hour. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. The suit that was fine but not remarkable the hair that was always going to do what it wanted, the face that was 38 years old and showed every one of them without apology. He looked like what he was. He had made peace with that a long time ago. The drive to the Harrington took 43 minutes. He parked in the public garage 2 blocks away because the hotel's valet line was long, and he was already running slightly late, and also because he was not going to pay $14 for valet parking on a school bus driver's salary. He walked the 2 blocks in the November cold with his collar closed and his hands in his jacket pockets, and told himself he would eat something, say hello to anyone who said hello to him, and leave at 9. The ballroom was everything he had expected, and a few things he had not. The scale of it was the first thing, the sheer volume of the space, the ceiling so far overhead that the chandeliers seemed to hang from somewhere theoretical. The density of wealth in the room was the second thing, not ostentatious exactly, but present in the way the air was present. Everywhere and unavoidable, the particular quality of expensive fabric and unhurried grooming and the easy physical confidence that comes from never having had to think very hard about money. Dale walked the back of the room. This was not strategic. It was simply where he wanted to be. He found a spot near the service doors, next to a tall table with a tray of used glasses that a catering staff member had not yet collected, and he stood there with his small plate of past, appetizers, which were better than he had expected. And he watched the room do what rooms like this do when they're full of people who are used to each other. He did not know who the major donor of the evening was. He had not done research on the Whitmore Foundation before coming. He had read the invitation, noted that it was a children's education fundraiser, and considered his responsibility to preparation fully discharged. He did not know that the Whitmore Foundation bore the name of the family who had endowed it, or that the family who had endowed it was present in the room, or that the founder's widow was standing near the stage in a dark green dress talking to the foundation's executive director. He did not know any of that. He ate his appetizers and stood in his corner and watched the room and thought, not for the first time, that human beings in large formal groups produced a very specific energy, a kind of competitive warmth. Everyone performing their best version of genuine pleasure at the company of other important people, and that this energy, while not unpleasant exactly, was something he could be in the vicinity of in reasonable comfort without needing to be part of it. He was 3/4 through his small plate and had checked the time twice, finding it only 7:41 and then 7:54, when the sound of the room changed. IT was not an announcement. No microphone, no chime of glass, no formal invitation to attention. It was something else. The organic drop of human conversation, when something genuinely unexpected begins to happen in the shared space. Nearest conversations went quiet first. Then the silence traveled outward in its wave until it crossed the full width of the ballroom and left 312 people listening to the sound of small footsteps on a polished floor. Dale looked up from his plate. A boy had stepped away from the front of the room and was walking. Dale's first thought was not recognition. His first thought was a simple observation that a child was crossing a ballroom alone, which was unusual, and that the room had noticed, which made sense. His second thought was to look at the boy's feet, because he had been a bus driver long enough that his eyes went automatically to the part of a child's body that told the most information fastest, and Garrett's feet were moving with the particular certainty of a person who knows where they're going and is not conducting any negotiation with themselves about it. His third thought was that the boy looked familiar. The fourth thought, which arrived approximately 1 second after the third, and with considerably more force, was that the boy was Garrett Whitmore, and that Garrett Whitmore was walking in a straight line across a ballroom full of 300 wealthy strangers, and that the line of that walk was pointed without question at the back of the room. Dale watched Garrett pass the first table. He watched him pass the second. He watched several men in the near vicinity of Garrett's path make small movements, leaning slightly, positioning themselves, the unconscious preparations of people who believe they might be the destination of something approaching. He watched each of those men recede into the general background as Garrett walked past them without a glance. Past Charles Burrell in his impeccable charcoal jacket, past Roger Ashby in his navy pinstripe, past the 2 men from the foundation board, past the dessert table, past the enormous white flower arrangement, past the edge of the crowd, into the less inhabited territory at the back of the room, the territory of service staff and fire exits and trays of used glassware. Dale turned his head. He looked behind himself at the service doors. He looked at the tray. He looked at the narrow strip of wall, between the tray and the door. He turned back. Garrett was 5 feet away. He stopped directly in front of Dale, in the last 6 inches of distance between them. He tipped his head back slowly, all the way back, looking up the full distance from his height to Dale's face. His expression was not tentative. It was not anxious. It was the expression of a person who has considered their options and made their choice. He reached out and took Dale's hand. Both of Garrett's small fingers wrapped around Dale's first 2 fingers and held there, certain and complete. And then Garrett said 8 words in a voice that was clear and steady, and not at all the voice of a child who had not spoken publicly in 18 months, but was absolutely the voice of a child who had been thinking about this moment for a long time and had decided that he was ready. He said, "You always slow down for the dog on Birchwood Lane." The silence in that room was enormous. 312 people holding their breath around the edges of that small and private and complete moment. Dale heard Diane before he saw her. He heard the small involuntary sound she made. Not a gasp exactly. Something more compressed than that. Something she'd been keeping contained for a very long time. He found her in his peripheral vision. 6 feet to his left, her hands pressed flat and hard over her mouth, her eyes open and fixed on her son's face. The tears were not dramatic. They were simply running, steadily and openly, down a face that was not trying to do anything except receive what was happening. She was hearing her child's voice in a room full of people for the first time in 18 months, and every part of her face was doing exactly what faces do when something they had stopped believing in arrives anyway. The woman standing near the stage, the kind-hearted one in the gold earrings. Patricia Holt herself as it happened, said into the silence with warm and complete delight, "Well, I believe that is a proposal if I have ever seen one." The laughter came immediately, warm and genuine. The best kind of social laughter, the kind that comes from a room full of people all experiencing the same surprise and pleasure at the same moment. And then the heads turned, all of them, in that slow sweep, from Garrett and Dale to the back of the room, across the distance, and then settling on Dale Cutter with combined attention of 312 wealthy Connecticut citizens who had just watched something extraordinary happen and were now extremely interested in what he was going to do about it. Dale stood very still for a long 3 seconds. He looked at Garrett's hand in his. He looked at Diane Whitmore, standing 6 feet away with her hands over her mouth and tears on her face, the most beautiful woman in the room by a considerable margin, watching him with an expression he could not entirely read, but that contained, underneath everything else, a very clear and very private question. He looked at the room, at the 312 people who were watching him with a warm and unanimous expectation, a crowd that has decided it is about to witness the kind of story that gets told at dinner parties for years afterward. And then Dale Cutter, school bus driver, 14, Alderman Street, Millhaven, Connecticut, understood in one completely clear and cold and private second exactly what every person in that room expected him to do. What every person in that room expected was simple and human and completely understandable. A beautiful woman, recently widowed, brilliant, kind, wealthy beyond any ordinary measure of that word, had made a public declaration 11 weeks ago that had been universally understood as a permanent closing of a door. And now a small boy, her son, the very child whose silence was a lock on that door, had crossed an entire ballroom to take the hand of one specific man, while 312 witnesses watched, and a kind woman with perfect timing had made the obvious observation out loud. Every person in that room was watching a door open. Dale was 40 feet from the stage, 40 feet from the podium, 40 feet from the moment that a man in his position, by every expectation of every social logic available, should simply walk toward. Beautiful woman, public declaration, adored child's open choice, 300 witnesses, the whole thing handed over at once with a bow on it. Any man in that room would have seized it with both hands and been absolutely correct to do so by the rules of the world those men lived in. Dale let go of Garrett's hand. She was in jeans and a plain dark coat, and her hair was down, and she looked, Dale thought, like herself, which was a specific and distinct thing from how she had looked in the ballroom 3 nights earlier. She had a paper coffee cup in both hands, and she was not on her phone, and she was not talking to anyone, and she was simply waiting, the way a person waits who has decided to wait, and is not impatient about it. Dale walked the rest of the half-block. He stood on the sidewalk with his 2 grocery bags and looked at her. She said, I was going to call, but I didn't have your number, and I didn't want to get it through the district office because that felt like an overreach. Dale said, "This is my house." She said, "I know. I'm sorry. Dana told me which street. I should have said that." He looked at her for a moment. Then he tilted his head toward the door. He put the groceries away while she sat at the kitchen table with her coffee, and he made himself a cup and sat across from her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. The kitchen was small and completely ordinary. The 4 drawings on the refrigerator, the dish drying rack with 2 plates and a mug, the window above the sink with the November light coming flat and white through it. She said, "I want to tell you what you did on Thursday." He said, "You don't have to." She said, "I know I don't. I want to." She looked at her coffee cup. She said, "Every person in that room, every single one, saw my son walk across the floor and make a choice. And every one of them immediately understood that choice as being about me, about what it meant for me, about what I had declared and what the declaration was worth, and what would happen next. Every single person in that room saw Garrett walk to you and thought about what it meant for my future." She looked up. She said, "You were the only one who saw what Garrett actually did. You were the only one whose first response was to him, to what it cost him, what it meant for him. You turned your back on everything in that room to look at my son." Dale was quiet. She said, "Do you have any idea how long I have been waiting for someone to just actually look at him?" Dale looked at his coffee cup. He thought about Chester on Birchwood Lane in the frost, and the oak at the corner of River Road, and a small folded square of paper placed on a bus step and abandoned without eye contact. He thought about Garrett's face in the rearview mirror on a sharp blue October morning, looking at him for the first time. He said, "He is worth looking at." There was a silence, then that was comfortable in the way silences are comfortable when 2 people are in the same room and not performing anything for each other. She said, "His father died on a Tuesday in February. Garrett was 4. Thomas was driving home from a board meeting, and the road was bad. He died on impact. The hospital called me at 11:47 at night. Garrett was asleep, and I sat in the kitchen until 6 in the morning trying to figure out how to tell him. And then at 6, he came down to the kitchen in his pajamas, and he looked at my face, and I could see that he already knew, in the way children know things before they know them. And I said Daddy was in an accident, and Daddy died, and Garrett nodded. He nodded. He was 4 years old, and he nodded. And then he went and sat on the back stairs for the rest of the day." She was not crying. She was telling the story the way people tell the stories they have told themselves enough times that the telling is no longer the hard part. The hard part was somewhere earlier and had already been moved through. She said, "He talked for about 3 weeks after that, normally or close to it. And then one morning he just stopped. It was not dramatic. He did not go to bed one night talking and wake up silent. He just gradually stopped, and then one day I realized several days had passed without a full sentence, and then several more passed, and then he was not talking anymore." Dale said, "How has he been?" "This week." She looked at him. The question surprised her. He could see that. It surprised her because it was not the question anyone would have expected him to ask at that particular moment in that particular conversation. Every man who had ever sat across from Diane Whitmore in any context had, in the moment of having her full attention, asked about her. Dale had asked about her son. She said, "He talked for an hour on Thursday night. To me, to the housekeeper, to himself. I heard him in his room talking to his stuffed animals at 10 o'clock at night, and I sat outside his door on the floor with my back against the wall and listened, and I did not go in." Dale said, "Good." She said, "He told me about the dog on Birchwood Lane. He told me the dog's name is Chester, and that Chester has a white face and cross paws. He told me you slowed down for it every morning." Dale said, "I've been slowing down for Chester for about 4 years. She said, "I know. He told me that too. He told me it wasn't for him. He said it just was something you did. He said that was why it was real." Dale looked at the window above the sink. He said, "My daughter's name is Penny. She's 9. She lives with her mother mostly. I see her Tuesdays and every other weekend. She's reading her way through every book ever published, apparently. She's never met a book she couldn't finish in a single sitting." Diane said, "What does she look like?" Dale said, "Like someone who has strong opinions about breakfast and correct information about everything. She's got her mother's nose and her grandmother's stubbornness, and she's the best person I know." Diane smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that starts somewhere behind the face and comes out because it cannot be stopped rather than because it has been deployed. They sat at that kitchen table for 2 hours. They talked about his work and her work, and what the Whitmore Foundation actually did as opposed to what the gala made it look like it did, which were related but not identical things. They talked about what it was like to be Thomas and what it was like to be without him, and they talked about what it was like to be Dale and what it was like to be raising Penny mostly from a distance, and whether the distance was the right arrangement or simply the arrangement that existed, and whether those were the same thing. They did not talk about the gala. They did not talk about what Garrett had done, or what Dale had done, or what the room had said, or what any of it meant for any kind of future. Neither of them mentioned the declaration Diane had made at the summer benefit. It was not that they were avoiding it. It simply was not the point. The point was two people in a small kitchen in November finding, cautiously and without performing anything, that the other person was exactly as real as they had suspected. Diane left at 1:30 in the afternoon. She stood at the front door with her coat on and her coffee cup long finished, and said, "Thank you for having me in." Dale said, "You can come back." She said, "I know." She drove away in her dark gray sedan, and Dale stood on the front step for a moment in the cold, and then went back inside and started thinking about what to make for dinner. IT took 8 months. This is not a romantic figure speech. It is a specific and accurate account of how long it took for Dale Cutter and Diane Whitmore to arrive at an understanding of each other that could honestly be called what it was. 8 months. The first of them cold, the last of them warm, all of them full of ordinary Tuesdays and ordinary conversations, and a particular kind of deepening that only happens when two people are both paying close attention and neither of them is in a hurry. Dale held back. He held back not from strategy and not from particular male pride of appearing uninterested in something you want very much, and not because he had read somewhere that playing things cool was a correct approach to a situation like this one. He held back because of Garrett. He held back because Garrett Whitmore had been through one catastrophic loss already, had lost his father and lost 18 months of his own voice to the grief of that losing, and was only now, in the weeks after the gala, beginning to cautiously reclaim the territory of himself. The dam had broken that night in the ballroom, the way dams break when they have been holding too long, not gradually but all at once, and what came through was a year and a half of stored in silent life that needed space to move through and find its level. Dale had watched this kind of unlocking in children before, the sudden opening of something that had been held tight for too long, and he understood that the period after the opening was as fragile as the period before. A child freshly come back to themselves was not a child who needed their world rearranged around a new emotional variable. So Dale moved slowly. He was consistent in the way he had always been consistent. Route 7 in the morning, good morning at the door, Chester on Birchwood, the oak at the corner of River Road. Garrett talked now, not always, not a flood, but steadily and with increasing ease. And the things he said were the real things, the things a child saves up when they have been silent and are finally free to spend. He told Dale things about Chester that he had clearly been thinking about for months. He told him that Chester was old and that old dogs were sadder than old people because they did not understand about being old. He told him that the oak tree at the corner of River Road was the biggest living thing he had ever personally stood next to. He told him that his dad had liked dogs, but they had never gotten one because of his mother's schedule, and that now that his dad was gone, he was not sure it would be right to get one, because the dog would have been for both of them. Dale listened to all of it. He answered when answers were invited. He asked questions that were actually questions, and not prompts dressed as questions. He slowed for Chester every morning and let the boy look. Diane came to the duplex on Alderman Street 3 more times in November. Each time she called first, which Dale had not asked her to do, but which she had decided was appropriate, and which he found he was grateful for. Each time they sat in the kitchen and talked, and each time the conversation was longer and went further in and came back more honest than the time before. She was, as it turned out, very funny, not in the performed way of people who have learned that humor is socially useful, but in the private way of people who find the actual world genuinely absurd in specific and identifiable ways. She was funny about the foundation board. She was funny about the men who had circled her after Thomas died. Not mean about them, just precise, and precision in that context was its own kind of devastating. She was funny about Garrett in the way only parents can be funny about the thing they love most in the world. The particular combination of terror and delight and absolute bewilderment that is the actual texture of parenting a person who is fundamentally their own self. Dale was not funny. Exactly. He was dry in a way that sometimes functioned as funny. He had, as Diane noticed in the second month, a particular quality of attention when other people were talking that was rare enough to be remarkable, a quality of receiving what was said without immediately preparing a response, the quality of a person who is actually listening rather than waiting for their turn. She mentioned this to him once, directly, and he looked mildly surprised, as if she had observed something about him that he had not known was observable. He did not tell her for a long time that he thought about her. He would not have used those words for it in any case. What he thought about, when he thought about it, was a specific texture of her presence in his kitchen, the way she held her coffee cup with both hands, and the way her voice changed when she talked about Garrett versus when she talked about the foundation versus when she talked about Thomas. He thought about the fact that she had driven to his street and parked at the curb and waited without a plan, because she had not wanted to overstep, and what that told him about the kind of person she was when no one was watching her be impressive. He thought about the kitchen and the 2 chairs and the window above the sink, and how those things had not meant much to him before, and now had a slightly different quality that he noticed when he was in there alone. He thought about Garrett. He thought about Garrett every morning on a route, and most evenings when the day had been quiet enough for thinking, and what he thought about was not strategy or outcome or any kind of future scenario. He thought about the specific boy, the specific quality of Garrett's attention when he was watching something he cared about, and he thought about what it meant that this particular boy had trusted him with the most expensive thing a person who's been hurt can give, which is the first real movement back toward the world. He thought about what a wrong move would cost that boy, and he was not willing to make a wrong move. So 8 months. Every week slightly further in, slightly warmer, no announcements, no declarations, no performances. December and then January, and then the long, cold gray of February, which was the worst month in that part of Connecticut, and the worst month in Diane's calendar for reasons that did not require explanation. Dale drove her to Thomas's grave on the February anniversary, not because she asked him to, but because she had mentioned it in passing in the way people mention the things they are dreading, and had said quietly that he would drive her if she wanted. And she had looked at him for a long moment and said yes. He waited in the car. He did not go to the grave. He did not feel that the grave was a place for him to be. He sat in the parking lot of the cemetery in the cold with the engine running and the heat on and waited for 40 minutes while she was wherever she needed to be. And when she came back and got into the car, he handed her a coffee he had walked to get from the gas station across the road while she was inside the gates, and she wrapped both hands around it and did not say anything for a while. He drove her home. He did not stay. He drove back to Alderman Street and made his dinner and read his book and went to bed at 9:30. She did not fall for him because he was working class. She was not. As far as Dale could tell from the 8 months of close observation that were his most reliable source of data on this question, a person who was drawn to anything symbolic or theoretical. She was specific. She was drawn to specific things done by specific people for specific reasons, and the abstract virtue of a thing was worth considerably less to her than its actual texture in practice. If he had been performing humility, performing goodness, performing working-class decency as a kind of statement about the kind of man he was, she would have seen in a week, and it would have been the end of it. What she was watching was Garrett. She was watching the way Garrett's body organized itself when he climbed onto the bus on the mornings when she drove him to the stop instead of leaving him to walk. She was watching the slight forward lean, the way he sat up rather than slumping, the way his face moved into a different register the moment the bus doors opened and Dale said good morning. She was watching the drawings that had resumed after a month's silence following the gala, new ones now, more ambitious, a whole series of them, Chester in different seasons, the oak in different lights, a very careful portrait of Dale's hands on the steering wheel that Garrett had left on the bus step on a morning in January, and that she knew about because Garrett had mentioned it 3 days later and then been briefly embarrassed at having mentioned it and changed the subject. She was watching a specific man do a specific thing, day after day after day, with her son, for no reason that served him, without any performance of it, without any variation based on whether she was watching or not, without any extra warmth deployed when she was visible and any cooling when she was not. It was the same thing every morning. Good morning, Chester, the oak, the complete and unhurried presence of a person who was simply there. This was what she fell for. Not an idea of a man, not a type, not a symbol of something she had been missing. A specific man, doing a specific thing with her specific child for a reason that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the fact that he was the kind of person who slowed down for a dog. Dale's side of it was slower even than hers. He was not withholding. He was not operating on strategy. He was simply a man who had been careful for a long time about the things he let himself want, because wanting things with any urgency had historically cost him in ways he was still carrying the receipts for, and the careful management of wanting was so habitual by now that he did not always recognize it as something he was doing. What he recognized, by late February, was that the 2 chairs at the kitchen table had become a place he went to in his mind when he was sitting by himself in the evening. Not the woman, not the possibility of anything, just the specific felt quality of those evenings, the specific way the conversation moved, the specific weight of having another person in the room who was paying as much attention to the world as he was and bringing more information to it than he had. He missed it when it was not happening. That was the whole truth of it. Stated plainly, he missed it when it was not happening. He missed her specifically, the way you miss a specific thing and not a general category of thing. In March, Penny came for a weekend and met Diane by accident in the parking lot of the grocery store, a Sunday afternoon collision of 2 shopping trips that lasted 4 minutes and was, by Penny's assessment, delivered to Dale that evening in the duplex with the particular thorough bluntness of a 9-year-old who has decided she has relevant data, and you should have it, the following: she seemed really actually nice to add, like actually not performing it, and she looked at you like she was waiting to see what you were going to say, which is not what people who are not interested do. Dale said, "You got all that in 4 minutes in a parking lot?" Penny said, "I'm a very fast reader." In April, Garrett asked Dale whether Chester had puppies. Dale said, "Chester's a boy dog, bud." Garrett said, "Oh," then whether there was a Chester puppy somewhere. Dale said he did not know. He said Chester was a good dog, and good dogs sometimes had puppies who were also good. Garrett said, "If there was a Chester puppy, I would name it something." Dale said, "What would you name it?" Garrett thought about this for the full length of Birchwood Lane, the full slow passage past Chester himself, who was at his post as always, and then he said, "I would name it Monday." Dale thought about that. He said, "Because of Monday mornings?" Garrett said, "Because every Monday morning you slow down. So Mondays are the good ones." Dale drove the rest of the route with both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road, and the particular feeling in his chest of a thing that had been put there to stay. He told Diane about it that evening. He called her, which he had begun to do in the evenings 2 or 3 times a week, just to call the kitchen table by other means, and he told her what Garrett had said about Monday mornings and the name, and she was quiet on the other end for a moment and then said, "He is going to want a dog." Dale said, "I know." She said, "Are you okay with a dog?" He said, "I'm okay with a dog." There was a small pause. Then she said, "Dale," and he said yes. And she said, "I need to tell you something." And he said, "I know." And she laughed, a surprised and completely real laugh, and said, "How do you know?" And he said, "Because you're the same as everyone else in that particular situation. You say the person's name, and then you say, 'I need to tell you something,' and then you say the thing." And she said, "Which is?" And he said, "That this is a thing now. This is just a thing." And she said, "Yes, that is what I was going to say." He was quiet. Then he said, "Me too. For the record." She said, "I know. That was how it happened. In April, on the phone, with no one watching. No ballroom. No 300 witnesses. No declaration. Just 2 tired people at the end of a long winter agreeing about the thing that had already been happening for months. He had not fallen for her because she was rich. This requires saying directly and plainly because it is the part of the story that will always invite the simpler interpretation, and the simpler interpretation is wrong. The money was never nothing. It was always there, always a fact, Always a great looming complication that had kept Dale certain for months that the right thing to do was maintain a careful distance, because the very last thing he ever wanted was to prove that laughing ballroom right. The ballroom had laughed because it had seen a lottery win, a lucky bus driver stumbling into a fortune. Every joke that the wealthy make about the poor is a version of that story. He would not be that story. He had been more certain of that than he had been of almost anything. What changed it was time, and specifically the quality of specific time. The specific Tuesday evenings and Sunday afternoons and phone calls and parking lot accidents, until the money stopped being a variable he was managing and became simply a fact about her situation, the way his rented duplex was a fact about his situation. And neither fact was a point, and both facts were simply true. What changed it was that she had come to the street and waited at the curb with her coffee cup without a plan, and had sat at his kitchen table with its dish rack and its grocery store coffee maker and its refrigerator covered in a child's drawings of a dog, and had not once, in 8 months and uncountable hours of conversation, said or done a single thing that suggested she was anywhere other than exactly where she wanted to be. That was the moment he understood she had chosen him, not the declaration on the phone. Before that, much earlier, but the moment he recognized it for what it was. She had been sitting at the kitchen table in February, the anniversary, the day after he had driven her to the cemetery and brought her the coffee from the gas station and driven her home without staying. She had come the next morning, unexpectedly, without calling first, and she had sat at his table with her coat still on, and he had made her coffee and set it in front of her, and she had looked at the 4 drawings on the refrigerator, the old ones, the ones Garrett had left on the bus step before the gala, Chester and the oak and the frost fence and the sparrow, and she had said very quietly, "He drew those before I knew who you were. He was drawing them for months before the gala. I didn't know until after." Dale had looked at the drawings with her. She said, "He saw you first. He always does. He sees the real ones first." Dale had stood at the counter with his coffee and understood, in the way things that have already been true for some time become available to conscious recognition, that this woman trusted her son's judgment in a way that went bone deep, and that her son's judgment had been quietly, persistently, daily endorsing Dale Cutter since November, and that she had been watching that endorsement accumulate since the first morning she had stood at the bottom of the driveway on Ridgecrest Circle and watched Garrett get on the bus and come home that afternoon with his shoulders slightly less tight than they had been in the morning. She had been watching since the very beginning. The choosing had not happened on the phone in April. The choosing had been happening every morning for 14 months on Birchwood Lane, and Dale had simply not known he was being chosen until he was all the way chosen. He set his coffee cup down. He said, "You want to go for a walk?" She looked up. She was still wearing her coat. She said, "Yes." They walked the neighborhood for an hour. The ordinary streets of Millhaven in February, salt-marked sidewalks and bare trees, and a particular quality of late winter light that made everything look slightly more itself than usual, more particular, more exactly what it was. They did not hold hands. They walked close enough that their jacket sleeves touched occasionally. When they were side by side, they talked about Penny and about Garrett and about the spring, and whether spring ever actually arrived in Connecticut or whether it simply pretended to arrive for 2 weeks and then reverse course, which they both agreed was essentially accurate. They walked past nothing important. They talked about nothing important. They were simply 2 people in a neighborhood on a February afternoon who had stopped pretending not to know what was happening. They came back to the duplex, and she said she needed to get Garrett from his play date, and he said, "Okay," and she looked at him for a moment, and then she leaned up and kissed him on the cheek. Quick and certain, the way you do a thing you have already done many times in your imagination, and are simply now doing in the actual world. And then she walked her car and got in and drove away. Dale went inside. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. He took the kettle off and looked at the 4 drawings on the refrigerator and thought about how Garrett had named the hypothetical dog Monday, and thought about a morning in November when a small folded square of paper had been placed on a bus step and abandoned without eye contact, and thought about Chester on Birchwood Lane in all his seasons, and thought about none of these things in particular and all of them at once. Then he made his tea and sat down. It was a Saturday in late September, a year and a half after the gala, and the backyard of the house on Ridgecrest Circle had never looked more like itself. Diane had not wanted a large wedding. This required no negotiation. Dale had not wanted a large wedding either. and their agreement on this point was so immediate and so complete that it had the quality of something already decided before either of them brought it up. They wanted their people. The people who had actually been present in the real texture of the 18 months between the ballroom and this backyard. Not the foundation board, not the social circuit, not the 312. Their people. The guest list came to 31. Dale's sister Carol was there with her husband Jim and their 2 teenage boys who had been informed that they were required to wear collared shirts and who had done so with the particular resigned dignity of teenage boys fulfilling a social contract they did not design. Dale's friend Warren from the bus yard, who had worked the north side routes for 11 years and was the person Dale had most to say to over lunch in the bus yard break room, was there with his wife Sandra. Penny was there, in a blue dress she had chosen herself and shoes she had opinions about, and she had spent the morning in Garrett's company helping him understand the correct way to handle a situation in which a large number of adults were going to be looking at you and making sounds, which apparently was to find something interesting to examine at regular intervals and not make eye contact with anyone who seemed likely to produce the sounds. Garrett was 7 now. He had been 7 since June. He was still not loud in the way some children were loud. Still not the boy he had been before the February of his father's death, and no one expected him to be. What he was present in the specific and full way of a child who has come back to themselves after being away for a long time and has decided that being here is actually pretty good. He was interested in things. He was interested in a great many things, in the specific way of a child who spent 18 months of intense private silence, doing whatever thinking happens below the surface of words, and has emerged from that time with a great number of considered opinions about a great number of subjects. He was interested, in particular, in dogs, in one dog specifically, in a small golden puppy that had arrived at Ridgecrest Circle in July, and had been named Monday with the completeness of a decision Garrett had apparently made long before the puppy existed in physical form, and who was, by the September of the wedding, approximately 14 pounds of focused attention, and unlimited confidence, and the loudest thing in any room she entered. Monday was at the wedding. She was at the wedding because Garrett had made clear that her absence was not among the options being considered, and because Dale, when consulted, had said that seemed correct to him, and because Diane, looking at her son's face when he said it, had agreed that correct was exactly the right word. So Monday was at the wedding in a small ribbon collar that Penny had tied on her that morning, and then untied and retied twice until it was satisfactory, and she had been comprehensively introduced to every one of the 31 guests within the first 20 minutes, and the teenage boys from Carol's family had spent a significant portion of the ceremony crouched at the edge of the patio trying to persuade her to come to them, which she was absolutely willing to do, except that she could not decide whether to come immediately or to make them work for it slightly. The ceremony was in the backyard, beneath the old maple that Diane had loved since they moved to Ridgecrest Circle, and that turned in September into a color somewhere between red and orange that had no good name. The chairs were borrowed from the church hall 2 streets over, plain wooden folding chairs arranged in 2 short rows with a strip of grass between them, and the whole setup looked, Dale thought from where he was standing, like exactly what it was, a gathering of people who genuinely wanted to be in the same place at the same time. The officiant was a woman named Rosemary Stahl, who had been a family court judge for 20 years before retiring, and who had known Diane since law school, and who had a voice that could have carried from one end of a very large courtroom to the other without effort, and who used precisely none of that carrying capacity today, keeping her voice at the easy conversational volume of a person talking to people they know. Garrett stood beside his mother. This had been his idea, presented to Diane 3 weeks before the wedding with the matter-of-fact completeness of a decision already made. He said, "I'll stand next to you." She said, "Are you sure?" He said, "Someone should be next to you." It seemed to him like the correct reasoning. And it was. Penny stood beside Dale. She stood very straight with her shoulders back, and her hands folded in front of her, and her opinions about her shoes suppressed the duration. Halfway through the vows, Monday escaped from the teenage boys at the edge of the patio and ran directly to Penny, who absorbed the interruption with enormous dignity, without moving from her spot, simply extending one hand downward to briefly receive Monday's attention, and then withdrawing it again with the self-possession of a 9-year-old who understands that some events require the subordination of personal enthusiasm to the needs of the occasion. Garrett watched his mother say her vows. Dale watched Garrett watching. The boy's face was doing the thing it did when he was looking at something he wanted to understand completely. The complete stillness and particular quality of attention that Dale had first noticed in a rear-view mirror on a sharp October morning 14 months before any of this. He was looking at his mother's face the way he looked at Chester on Birchwood Lane, which was to say with the whole of himself, not performing looking, but actually doing it, taking in the specific thing in front of him without editing it into something more manageable. Diane said her vows clearly and without a single break in her voice, which Dale had expected, because she was that kind of person, and then Dale said his, which were not long, because he was not a person who said things at greater length than the thing required, and the thing required. You are the specific person I chose to come toward, and Garrett is a specific boy who told me Mondays are the good ones, and I would like to be here for every Monday we get. Rosemary Stahl said the words that made the legal fact. Dale kissed Diane in a backyard in September with 31 people watching, and Monday, losing her mind about something at the edge of the patio, and Garrett standing very still beside his mother with his hands at his sides, and then, after a moment, reaching out to find Dale's hand the same way he had reached for it in the ballroom, certain and unhesitating, both small fingers wrapping around Dale's first two. Dale took his hand. Penny started crying, which she would later describe as an involuntary biological response, and not a reflection of her feelings on the matter, a position that no one in the family ever formally challenged. There was a lunch after the ceremony, the long table set up on the patio with food that Sandra from the bus yard had organized because she had said she would and had meant it, and the afternoon went the way the best kind of afternoon goes. Slowly, loosely, with no agenda, except the continued presence of people who like being in the same place. The teenage boys eventually got Monday to come to them, and spent the afternoon in the corner of the yard conducting negotiations with her about fetch, which Monday was interested in conceptually, but had strong opinions about the correct fetch-to-rest ratio. Penny ate 3 pieces of cake and read 40 pages of book, and had 2 long conversations with Carol that Dale was not privy to, and that Carol described afterward only as extremely thorough. Garrett, at some point in the middle of the afternoon, climbed into Dale's lap. He did not announce this. He did not ask permission. He simply appeared beside Dale's chair, assessed the situation, and climbed up with the unambiguous physicality of a child who has decided where they want to be and is proceeding accordingly. He sat there for the better part of an hour with Monday occasionally attempting to join them and being redirected by Garrett with the particular patience of a person who loves a dog and also has standards. Dale put his arm around him. Garrett leaned back. Diane watched this from across the table. She was talking to Rosemary Stahl about something, her face animated and warm, and at some point she looked across the table at Dale and her son, and she went quiet for a moment in the middle of whatever she had been saying. Then she smiled, the real one, the one that came from somewhere behind the face, and she turned back to Rosemary and said, "Sorry, what were we saying?" The afternoon light went long and golden to the maple and across the yard, and the lunch table, and the faces of 31 people who had come because they genuinely wanted to be there, and Monday fell asleep in the corner by the fence with the teenagers sitting on either side of her in their collar shirts, and Penny finished her book and started another one, and Garrett told Dale at some length about a documentary he had watched about very deep ocean fish and the specific disturbing qualities of their faces, which Dale agreed were pretty disturbing when you thought about it, and the September afternoon did what September afternoons do in Connecticut. It stayed beautiful just long enough to make you believe it could last, and then the light began to go and the air got its edge back and people started finding their coats. By 7 o'clock the yard was quiet again, and the 3 of them were inside with Monday asleep at the foot of the couch and the dishes done, and a house with a particular full and settled feeling of a house that has had a lot of people in it and is now peacefully returned to itself. Garrett was asleep by 8:30, Monday at the foot of his bed as per her understanding of the sleeping arrangements, which were that she slept at the foot of his bed, and if it got cold, that was a separate situation she was willing to address on a case-by-case basis. Dale and Diane sat on the couch with the television on and the sound low, not watching it particularly. After a while, she put her feet up on the coffee table and leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stayed like that for a long time, not talking, not needing to, in particular comfortable silence of 2 people who have arrived somewhere they were both heading toward for a long time without knowing it. Outside, the maple was still and dark, and the neighborhood was quiet, and somewhere on Birchwood Lane Chester was in his house, because Chester had slowed down a great deal in the past year, and the morning patch of grass was a warm weather post now. And this was fine. This was what happened. Garrett knew this. Garrett had said, with complete equanimity, that Chester was getting older, but that was okay, because Monday was going to be old someday too, and that was just how it worked. That was just how it worked. Here is the story the ballroom thought it was watching. A lucky school bus driver. The right place at the right time. A millionaire's vow and a silent child, an entire room full of witnesses to a moment so perfectly cinematic that it essentially directed itself. The ordinary man who stumbled into a fairy tale and walked out of a ballroom with the whole lottery in his arms. That is the story those 312 people went home and told at dinner tables all over Connecticut that November, and that is the story that circulated through the social world and had been trying to navigate for 2 years. And there's a version of it that is not wrong exactly, but is not the real story. The real story is this. A small boy lost his father when he was 4 years old. He lost him on a Tuesday in February, on a road that was icy, in an accident that was random and terrible and that no one planned and no one could have stopped. He lost his father, and in the months after that loss, he pulled inward with a completeness that frightened every adult in his life. And the frightening of those adults created around him a specific kind of pressure. The pressure of people who are desperately trying to fix something they cannot fix and are making the unfixable thing worse with every attempt. He needed one thing. He needed a person who would simply see him without needing him to be different from what he was. He needed a person who would say good morning and mean it and ask nothing else. He needed a person who would slow down for the dog on Birchwood Lane not because of him, but because slowing down for the dog was simply what that person did. And that consistency, that unconditioned plainness, would eventually convince him that the world contained at least one reliable thing that was not contingent on performance of being okay. He found that person on a school bus, not in a therapist's office, not in a tutoring center, not in any of the arranged and formal spaces the adults in his life had constructed specifically to help him. On a bus, in the most ordinary and unglamorous setting available, driven by a man in an ill-fitting jacket who earned his salary in a range that would have made every person in that ballroom wince. And when the time came, the time that everyone who loved Garrett had been hoping for, without daring to name it, when the weight finally got light enough to put down, he did not walk to the most impressive man in the room. He did not walk to the richest one, or the most connected one, or the most practiced at performance of warmth. He walked past every single one of them and went all the way to the back of the room, to the service doors and the tray of used glasses, and the man who looked least impressive of anyone there. And he took his hand, because that was the person who had seen him, not seen through him, not seen around him, not seen the version of him that might someday be better. Seen him, right then, exactly as he was, for 14 months of ordinary mornings, without asking anything back. Dale chose the child over the fairy tale. And in the end, the child turned out to be how he got the whole family anyway. This is the part that needs to be said plainly, because it is the part that the simpler version of the story always leaves out. Dale did not do what he did with Garrett because he was positioning himself for something. He did not slow down for Chester because he was building a case. He did not say good morning with that particular quality of attention because he had worked out that goodness would be rewarded. He did it because he was the kind of person who did it, built from 38 years of small habitual attentions to the world in front of him. And the building of that kind of person happens in the opposite direction from strategy. It happens through 1,000 mornings of deciding that the child climbing onto your bus at 7 in the morning deserves your actual presence and not the minimum required to move the vehicle. The money was always going to be what it was. The world was always going to tell the simpler story. The ballroom was always going to laugh and see a lottery win. And Dale was always going to be the person who turned his back on the room to kneel down and look at a boy's face. He still drives Route 7. He did not stop. This needs to be said clearly, because it would be very easy to assume that the September wedding changed the work, made it optional, made a kind of performance of the virtue that had already been rewarded. It changed nothing. He is still there at 7:12 at Ridgecrest Circle, still there at 7:17 at the first Birchwood stop, still slowing down as Chester's patch of grass comes into view. Chester, who is slower now and sometimes is not there, but is still sometimes there, still lying in that strip of grass with his white muzzle and his crossed paws. And the bus eases back as it passes, and Garrett is not on the bus anymore, because Garrett is in second grade, and second grade starts later on a different route. But the slowing down is not for Garrett. It never was. It is for Chester. It is for the recognition of a specific old dog living out a particular life in the specific morning light on Birchwood Lane. And it costs nothing. It means everything, and Dale Cutter would not stop doing it for any reason. He drives his route every morning because 41 children still board that bus every morning carrying things. Carrying the weight of households and parents and nights that did not go well and mornings that started wrong, and the specific private griefs of being small in a world designed for larger people. Some of them are carrying things too heavy for their size. Some of them are waiting for a person to notice. Most of the adults in their lives are busy and good and doing their best, and also because this is how it works. Not quite looking, not really looking, not the way a person looks when they have decided that looking is the actual work. Dale looks every morning, 41 times, before the world gets its full grip on those children for the day. He is one of the people in those children's lives who is simply willing to see them. That might just be the most important job there is. A whole ballroom full of powerful and impressive and well-intentioned people, 312 of them, all of them looking at the same room, all of them watching the same boy walk across the same floor. Not one of them saw what that boy was doing. Not one of them understood that he was not making a declaration about his mother's future. He was walking toward the one person who had looked at him and seen him without needing him to be something else. He was walking 40 feet across a polished ballroom floor, which for a 6-year-old who had not spoken publicly in 18 months was not a small thing. It was the bravest thing he had ever done in his life, and he was doing it for the simplest and most irreducible reason. Because one person, in an unglamorous corner of his small daily world, had been real with him every morning for 14 months and asked for absolutely nothing back. Every important person in that room walked right past. The person that boy walked toward was standing next to a tray of used glasses. So here's the question. The real one, the one that is worth sitting with after the story is over. Who is the person in your own life who saw you, not managed you, not helped you, not fixed you, not added you to the list of people they were responsible for? The person who simply saw you back when you felt invisible to everyone else in the world, back when the weight was too heavy and the room was too loud, and you were standing in the back next to the service doors. And that person looked up for what they were doing and said good morning and meant it and asked nothing back. Have you ever told them what that meant to you? Not in the way we mention things, not in a passing comment or a Christmas card. Have you actually told them? Tell this community about them in the comments. A name, a moment, a morning, whatever fits. Real stories are read, every single one. There is no rush. There is no word count. Just the truth of a person who saw you when the world was looking straight past you, and what that cost them, which was nothing, and what it gave you, which was everything. If this story settled somewhere in you tonight, if it touched a part of you that has spent any portion of your life standing at the back of a room, hoping someone would simply notice you were there, then do one small and easy thing. Hit that subscribe button if you have not yet. Drop a like so the next person who needs this story can find their way to it. Leave your own story in the comments. This channel is built for the person standing at the back of the room. The stories told here are for that person. Every single one. The next one is a good one. Trust that completely.